There was no bread that morning, no hot water, no supply carts at the palace gates. The hospital had run out of clean bandages 2 days ago, and no one had thought to ask where the fresh ones came from or whose hands had washed and folded them. The stables were quiet in the wrong way, the silence of animals waiting for grain that had not arrived. And the grain store itself was locked, because the woman who kept the spare key in her apron pocket had taken that apron with her when she left. Lady Vespera stood in the center of the royal kitchen in her new Luna gown. The gown was the right color. The kitchen was cold. The noble ladies around her had never needed to know how to start a fire from banked coals, and that knowledge had walked out of the palace 3 nights ago, with the rest of the things that everyone had always assumed would simply be there. Adrian stepped through the kitchen doors and stopped. He had been told a handful of servants had left. A general met him at the door with a different report. The garrison had not been fed. The messenger stations had stopped running. The children in the Eastern District had not received their morning meal. The medicine stores were sealed with no record of which cabinet held what. 3 of the large farms beyond the walls had not sent their harvest wagons. Elder Caldus said, "Bring the Omegas back," Adrian asked. "How many left?" Captain Oren said. "All of them who knew they had somewhere to go." The silence that followed was not the silence of a pause. It was the silence of a kingdom beginning to understand something it had been refusing to understand for a very long time. On a hill outside the border, Mira walked without looking back. Behind her, the road was not empty. There were people carrying cooking pots and medicine bags and seed pouches and children and the worn satchels that held years of knowledge about how a kingdom actually ran. They had not marched. They had simply left. 2 weeks before, Mira had still been Luna. She had been running the morning food distribution for the lower quarter when Adrian's message found her. She knew the quarter's numbers from memory, who had a newborn, which house was short on flour, which elder needed the softer grain because his teeth could not manage the standard ration. Nadine had brought the kitchen list. Lysa had come with a report about the hospital's depleted medicine cabinet. Bren had set a logistics ledger on the table and pointed to a supply discrepancy in the southern stores that had been growing for 3 weeks. Mira had worked through all of it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 8 years, who had learned long ago that the actual work of keeping people alive was not ceremonial and did not wait for council approval. The council had been meeting without her. She had known that too. Elder Caldus had been building his case since the previous winter, the careful, slow work of a man who understood that large things moved by accumulation rather than single events. He told Adrian that Mira's closeness with the Omega caste was destabilizing. He told him that noble houses were uncomfortable, that their wolves bristled at the shifting of the hierarchy, that alliances were cooling. He placed Lady Vespera in front of the council like a solution. High birth, strong connections. The kind of woman who understood that distance from the lower castes was not cruelty but order. Adrian met Mira in the small room off the eastern corridor, the one they had used for private conversations since the early years of their pairing. He did not sit down. He said the decision was necessary for the kingdom's stability. He said she was still his mate in every way that mattered. He said politics required things that private feeling did not. Mira looked at him for a long moment. "Will they still bow to me tomorrow?" He did not answer. She removed the Luna's cord from her wrist slowly, without ceremony, and set it on the table between them. "You do not get to keep me in private after erasing me in public." Adrian said. "This is politics, Mira. It does not change what you are to me," she said. "Then politics is the name you give betrayal when you want it to sound necessary." She left before he could watch her face change. She walked down the corridor with her spine straight and her breathing measured, and she did not look for him to call her back. She did not stop walking until she reached the old servant's entrance at the back of the palace wall. She had intended to leave alone. The gate was already crowded. Nadine was there with 6 of the kitchen staff. She was not waiting for permission. She had already packed. Lysa stood to one side with a medicine case and 2 apprentices who had been working under her without official status because the guild did not license Omegas above basic rank. Bren held a copy of the storage ledger, not the original, which belonged to the palace, but a careful duplicate he had been making 1 entry at a time for 2 months. The woman who managed the children's ward had 3 orphaned toddlers in her arms and 4 older children clustered at her skirt. 2 laundresses carried bundles of clean bandages, folded and counted. A farmer from the northern supply chain carried seed pouches sewn into an inner lining of her coat. Mira stood at the gate and looked at all of them. She said they did not need to come because of her. Nadine said they were not coming because she had ordered them to. They were coming because, for the first time, there was a door open and no one was calling them traitors for walking toward it. Mira understood the weight of what she was about to say. If she told them to stay and keep the palace running, she would be using the same argument that had always been used to keep people in systems that damaged them, the argument of indispensability, dressed up as duty. She would be saying, "You must stay because leaving hurts someone else." She would be saying, "Your suffering is the price of their stability." She had heard those words before. She would not be the one to say them. "If you come," she said, "you come as people, not as my servants." They went out through the gate in the quiet of the early morning, before the palace bells rang, before the day shift arrived, before anyone in the noble quarter had opened their shutters to look. They did not burn anything. They did not take gold or weapons or anything that belonged to someone else. They took their tools and their medicine and their seeds and their children, and the knowledge in their hands and heads that no one had ever thought to write down in any book that mattered. Valtheris discovered what was missing in the hours that followed, not all at once, 1 thing at a time. The first day, the absences were inconvenient. The second day, they were alarming. The third day, they were structural. The baker, who arrived to find the kitchen hearth cold, understood, in theory, that it needed to be lit. He did not know that the coals had to be kept banked overnight, that the timing of the first heat mattered, that the dough for the morning's bread had needed to begin rising 6 hours earlier. No bread that day. The hospital orderly who found the clean bandage cabinet locked went looking for the secondary supply. There was a secondary supply. It was in a room that required a different key, kept by a woman who had packed it in her apron pocket, because it had been her apron pocket for 12 years and the key had simply lived there. No clean bandages that day. The stable master arrived to feed the war horses after a long campaign march. He knew horses needed feed. He did not know that horses worked hard. The previous day needed the lower energy grain mix and not the performance blend, and that feeding them the wrong ration after exertion led to a specific kind of colic that was difficult to treat once it set in. By nightfall, 3 horses were sick. In the eastern quarter, the children waited for their morning porridge until midday. No one arrived. Vespera tried to organize the noble ladies to cover what was missing. They were not incompetent women. They were women who had been raised in a system that sorted work by status and had never required them to know what the lower status work actually involved. They could not find where the medicines were stored because no one had written down a map, and the knowledge had lived in Lysa's memory. They could not calculate the grain rations because Bren's original ledger system required context that only Bren had. They could not keep the messenger system running because the routes had been memorized by 3 Omega runners who were currently walking toward a disused warehouse outside the border. Caldus demanded that examples be made. Orin told him that making examples of people did not teach the remaining staff how to run the pharmacy or reheat the garrison's food. Adrian walked through the hospital ward that evening and found a soldier with an infected wound being treated with the wrong preparation because the noble medic covering the shift had not known the difference. He stood in the corridor afterward and did not speak for some time. Vespera found him there. She had spent the day moving between disasters that were too small to be dramatic and too constant to ignore. She had been told her entire life that the Omega caste was the lowest, the most replaceable, the least consequential. She looked at the empty kitchen and the locked medicine room and the confused soldiers asking where their supplies were, and she said, quietly, they did not abandon the kingdom. The kingdom taught them they were never part of it. Adrian did not answer. He was beginning to understand that the things he had not thought about were the same things that had been keeping him alive. Greyfield Hollow was a disused trade station, 4 hours outside the border. It had stone walls and a leaking roof, and 3 large storage rooms that were mostly empty. For the first 2 days, it felt like freedom. On the 3rd day, the food situation became clear. They had brought what they could carry, which was not the same as what they needed for 140 people through an indefinite stay. Children were getting sick from cold and disrupted routine. 2 older Omegas who had lived their entire lives inside the palace structure were quietly terrified in a way they could not entirely articulate the terror of open space after a lifetime of defined roles. People began coming to Mira for every decision. Where should families sleep? Who would cook tomorrow? How should the medicine be rationed? What happened to the woman who kept starting fights over the water schedule? What happened if someone wanted to go back? Mira answered. She answered everything because she knew how, because she had spent 8 years making decisions for people, and because it was easier than building a system where the decisions did not all route through her. Nadine watched this for 3 days. Then she sat down across from Mira and said, "Leaving is not the hard part, child. Feeding the people who leave with you is." Mira stared at the list in her hands. She had been managing this the same way she had managed the palace. Herself at the center, the system radiating outward from her judgment. She had been proud of that once. She had told herself it was competence. She understood now that it was also control, and that there was not always a clean line between the two. She had traded one hierarchy for another arrangement that still depended entirely on one person knowing everything. If she left, or was wrong, or was simply tired, the whole structure would shudder. She had not built something resilient. She had built something dependent on her being exceptional indefinitely. That was not a community. That was a different version of the same problem. Jarek began speaking at the evening fires around that same time. He was not subtle. He said that Valtheris had grain because Omega hands had grown it and stored it and carried it through every winter. He said that grain still sat in those stores. He said that starving while their labor kept someone else fed was not a moral position. His argument had a logic she could not simply dismiss, because the part he was describing as injustice was an injustice. It was what came after that frightened her. Lisa found Mira late on the 5th evening, sitting alone with Bren's draft of Aeskel's catalog he had been building. She did not sit down. She said, "If every answer must pass through you, then we have not left hierarchy. We have only changed who stands at the top." The sentence landed like a hand pressing flat on a wound she had not admitted was there. Mira looked at the list in front of her. 140 people. Their knowledge spread across dozens of heads. Nobody here was just a rank. They were a woman who could calculate grain yield, a man who knew 3 different techniques for preserving meat in summer, a girl of 14 who had memorized the entire medicine distribution schedule because she liked systems, an old man who could fix almost anything made of wood and iron. Bren's catalog was not finished, but the shape of what it could become was visible. She called him over. She told him to finish it, not as an administrative record, but as the foundation of how Greyfield Hollow organized itself. Not who you were born as, what you could do, what you wanted to learn, who you could teach, what you needed. The skill ledger took shape over the next 2 days. Bren ran the first session. He went around the circle with a plain notebook and asked every person who showed up to list what they knew. Not what they had been permitted to do, what they actually knew. A woman who had been a laundress for 20 years turned out to have spent those years maintaining complex chemistry, the ratios of soap, ash, water, and temperature that kept linens clean and bandages sterile. A man who had managed the Palace Chuang for a decade knew more about animal health, nutrition cycles, and seasonal care than any noble hired stable physician. People discovered that their knowledge was not small. It had simply never been called by a name that anyone with power had bothered to record. From the ledger emerged working groups that did not have ranks: a food guild, a healing guild, a shelter group, a child care circle, a trade circle, a security watch. Each group had rotating leadership. Mira was given a coordinating role, not permanent, not supreme. The community could vote to change it. She accepted these terms the way she would have accepted a corrected calculation, without arguing, because they were right. The ledger became the first unwritten law of Greyfield Hollow. No one would be asked where they came from. They would be asked what they could do and what they wanted to become. Jarek called a meeting of his own on the 7th night. He did not use the food guild space or the healing house. He built his own fire at the edge of the hollow and let it be known that anyone who had been waiting for someone to finally say the true thing was welcome. A number of people came, more than Mira had expected. He stood before the fire and he did not hide what he wanted. He wanted the water supply to Valtheris interrupted at the Eastern Channel. He wanted the noble houseland records taken and burned. He wanted noble children held until Adrian signed new laws. He wanted the king to kneel. Some people who listened had scars. Some had buried children because of laws that said Omega testimony did not count in noble courts. Some had spent their lives being told they were the lowest thing in a hierarchy built on their labor. Their anger was not invented. It was the specific anger of people who had been patient for longer than patience should ever be required of anyone. Mira did not stand up immediately. She sat with the weight of what Jarek had said and felt the pull of it, not agreement, but recognition. She understood why a person would want Valtheris to hurt. What she saw when she looked ahead was something else. If they cut the water, the Eastern Quarter's sick children would suffer first. The noble quarter had private wells. If they burned the land records, the families of minor Omega-descended landholders would lose what little documentation protected what little they had. If they took children as hostages, they would be teaching the next generation that children could be used as political leverage. They would have built a new hierarchy whose currency was the depth of historical suffering. The most wronged at the top, everyone else scrambling for position beneath them. She stood up before Jarek could call for a vote. She said, "I need one night. I am calling a full assembly in the morning. Everyone speaks. Then we decide together." The assembly began before sunrise. Jarek presented his plan again. He did it clearly and without apology. A woman in the back said she had waited 20 years for someone to say those things out loud. An older man said he was afraid of dying in this field while his former employers ate well. Mira waited. When Jarek finished, she said, "Your anger is not the danger. The danger is letting pain decide who is allowed to be human." Bren spread the logistics ledger on a flat stone. He walked through the numbers without emotion. If the water was cut, the Eastern District's civilian hospital would lose function within 6 hours before the noble quarter felt any disruption at all. The noble houses had private water storage. The sick did not. Lysa said that if they held noble children, they would be doing what had been done to every Omega child who had been used as guarantee for a parent's labor contract. She said she had treated those children when they grew up. She said she would not create more of them. Nadine stood last. She said, "We did not leave their kitchens to become the hand that starves someone else's child." The silence afterward was different from the silence of agreement. It was the silence of people holding two true things at once: the legitimate grief of what they had survived and the shape of what they refused to become. Mira laid out the alternative: humanitarian aid to Valtheris civilians, with conditions. Not to the military, not to the noble houses, to the hospital, the children's quarter, the civilian food supply. In exchange, a public commitment to review the caste laws, with Pax Assembly oversight, before any aid continued past the first month. Greyfield Hollow would not submit to the crown. It would trade with a kingdom that was willing to change. Jarek called her a collaborator. He said she was giving the king a way out he had not earned. Mira said the community would vote. The vote was not unanimous, but it was clear. Jarek was removed from the security watch by the people who had been in it with him. He was not handed to Adrian. He was not exiled. He was given labor assignments and required to attend the assembly for the next month, the same as anyone else, with the same vote and the same voice and the same access to the ledger. He did not like it. That was not the point. Adrian came to the border on the 18th day. He came with a small group. No military formation, no show of force. Mira met him outside the Hollow's eastern boundary with Nadine, Lysa, Bren, representatives from the Food Guild and the Childcare Circle, and 2 members of the Security Watch who stood at a distance and did not pretend to be anything other than what they were. She did not go to meet him alone. She had decided some time ago that decisions that affected 140 people should not be made by one person in a private meeting. Adrian looked at Greyfield Hollow. The kitchen smoke was visible from the road. The smell of it reached him before anything else: bread and boiled grain, the smell of a working kitchen, a smell that had been absent from his own palace for 3 weeks. Children were audible somewhere inside. 2 people were arguing near the supply entrance about something to do with inventory. No one stopped working when he arrived. No one arranged themselves to receive him. No one knelt. He had spent his entire life in spaces that reorganized themselves around his presence. This space did not. It continued with the particular indifference of a place that had decided what it was for and was busy being it. He said he needed the Omegas to come back. Mira said, "They were always suffering. You only noticed when the suffering reached the palace." He said, "Valtheris could not sustain the crisis." She said, "Then ask your council to feed your kingdom." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was asking for help, not commanding, not threatening, asking. Mira looked at the people standing with her. She had not prepared a single speech. She had prepared a list of conditions, reviewed the previous evening in a circle of 8 people who had each added something and changed something, and she was going to read it exactly as the circle had agreed. She listed the conditions, banning the support caste designation, Omega land rights, the right to leave employment, the right to guild certification, the right to testify in tribunal without a sponsor, no punishment for anyone who had left. Greyfield Hollow recognized as an independent commune. Aid routed through guild distribution. Not the royal supply chain. No aid to the military. Adrian said the council would not accept everything at once. She said, "Then ask your council to feed your kingdom." She had not changed the sentence. She did not need to. He went back. He brought the conditions to the full council. Caldus read the list and called it a surrender. He said if Omegas had rights, the hierarchy would not hold. He said, the structure of Valtheris had existed for 130 years, and one exodus did not erase its legitimacy. Vespera had been sitting quietly through most of the session. She had been sitting quietly through most of the past 3 weeks, moving through the practical failures of the palace, watching what the absence of specific knowledge looked like in specific rooms. She stood up. She was not a natural orator. She spoke like someone who had practiced the words and was afraid of messing them up. She said, the noble ladies had not been able to staff the hospital. She said no one in the council chamber could recite the current medicine rotation or the grain ration formula or the route schedule for the Eastern supply line. She said the people who had held all of that knowledge had left, and the people who remained had discovered they could not replicate it. She said they did not abandon the kingdom. The kingdom taught them they were never part of it. She sat down. Oren told the council that a military campaign against Greyfield Hollow would require feeding and supplying soldiers, and that the people who knew how to do that were in Greyfield Hollow. A general countered that they could conscript. Oren asked who would cook for the conscripts, treat their wounds, care for their horses, and manage their logistics. The general did not answer. Adrian looked at the council chamber. He looked at the table where Caldus was waiting for a decision that would go the old way. He said, for years, we called them powerless because we could not survive admitting how much power they carried. He called for a catering staff to prepare the council's evening session. No one came. No tray arrived. The empty table did what 3 hours of argument had not. Adrian signed the emergency decree suspending the support caste laws and called for a pack assembly within 30 days. The first aid convoy left Greyfield Hollow on a Tuesday. Mira did not lead it. The Food Guild coordinated the distribution. Nadine returned to the palace kitchen with 6 others. She was not there to serve the council. She was there to cook for the children in the Eastern Quarter, who had gone hungry for too long. A noble lady met her at the kitchen door and asked about the morning's council breakfast. Nadine said. "The kitchen is feeding the sick today. If you are hungry, join the line." Lysa opened the hospital's temporary ward with her own name on the treatment records, not a noble physician standing in front of her name with his name placed above hers. Bren set up the distribution ledger as a public document. Anyone who wanted to read the numbers could read them. Mira walked through the palace corridor toward the room she had occupied for 8 years. She had not planned to come this way. She had been checking the eastern supply route with Bren's distribution contact, and the fastest path back to the courtyard ran past the door she had lived behind. She stopped. She put her hand on the wood. The wood was the same. The corridor smelled the same, that specific combination of stone and old lamp oil, and the faint herbal residue of the cleaning mixture the housekeepers used, a smell so specific and so long associated with a version of her life that it moved through her like something physical. She stood there for a moment. Then she took her hand off the door and walked away. Adrian had come around the corridor corner from the garden direction. He stopped when he saw her. He did not speak. He watched her walk away from the door. He understood something in that moment that he had not been able to fully articulate in any of the council sessions or border meetings. She was helping his kingdom. She had not come back to it. Those were not the same thing, and he had spent a long time treating them as interchangeable, and they were not, and she had known they were not for much longer than he had. The pack assembly was difficult. It was supposed to be. Several Alpha representatives said that if Omegas could leave service at will, labor contracts would become impossible to enforce. A free wolf from the Western Territories said that was an argument for better labor contracts, not for coerced ones. A Northern Pack elder said the hierarchy had kept order for generations. Mira said, "If your house only stands because someone is forbidden to leave it, then your house was already collapsing." The vote on the permanent law changes took 3 sessions over 2 weeks. Mira attended all of them with Bren and Lisa, and a rotating delegation from the Hollow. They were not the loudest voices in the room. They did not need to be. The record spoke on their behalf. 3 weeks of documented system failure in a kingdom that had called its most essential workers its least significant ones. It was not clean. Alliances shifted between sessions. 2 Alpha representatives who had initially voted against land rights changed their position after a private review of their own pack's labor records showed how much of their productivity depended on Omega workers who had no legal recourse if treated badly. The support caste designation was abolished by a majority, but not a consensus. Land rights passed narrower than the others. Guild access passed. Tribunal testimony rights passed after 2 amendments that Mira's representatives pushed back on until the language was clearer. The recognition of Greyfield Hollow as an autonomous commune passed last, the smallest margin of all. The skill ledger was included in the new law as an alternative framework for labor agreements, not the only way, but a legitimate one, recognized across all pack territories. Jarek attended 2 of the assembly sessions. He said at the second one that the law changes were not enough. He was not wrong. Mira said that the law changes were a floor, not a ceiling, she said. Greyfield Hollow's job now was to build things that showed what was possible. Jarek did not agree with her. He'd sat in the assembly anyway, with the same vote as everyone else. That was enough for now. After the assembly, Adrian found Mira at the boundary marker. He had not arranged the meeting. He had not sent word ahead. He was in plain clothes. He stood at the stone post that marked where Valtheris ended and where Greyfield Hollow began. He said he was sorry for replacing her. He said he was sorry for calling it politics, as though the word made the harm into something smaller. He said he was sorry for the years when he had seen her work and called it support instead of leadership. He said he was sorry for the night she had told him exactly what he was doing and he had chosen not to hear it. He asked if there was a path forward between them. Mira listened to everything, she said. I will help your people when they are hungry. I will not return to the throne that learned my worth only after losing my labor. He asked if that was everything. She looked at him for a moment at the man she had known before the title and the counsel and the choice he had made. There may be roads between our people, she said. Do not mistake them for a road back to your bed. He nodded. He did not argue. He did not try to find a different question that might produce a different answer. He stood for a moment with the weight of what she had not said, which was not nothing, and which he understood well enough to leave alone. He walked back across the boundary line without asking her for anything more. The hollow was not the same place it had been 3 months ago. The leaking roof had been repaired by the shelter group, which had a waiting list because 3 more families had arrived from a distant pack, seeking the commune's recognition. The healing house had a small herb garden that Liza had started with seeds from the original medicine supply. The Food Guild was calculating winter stores. The trade circle had begun cautious exchanges with 2 neutral merchant groups who were interested in the commune's production and not interested in its politics. The childcare circle was running a morning school. Nadine and Bren were in the middle of what had become a standing argument about grain allocation for the cold months, and neither of them was going to give ground without full data, and both of them were right about different things, which was how most useful arguments worked. Mira sat in the council circle, not at the center, in the circle. She had a role in the coordinating group, which met twice a week and could be overruled by a full community vote, which had happened once already. On a question of trade terms she had thought was settled. She had been wrong about the trade terms. The community had been right. She had updated her position and moved on, the way anyone in any circle should when the people they were working with had better information than they did. She had been Luna for 8 years, and no one had overruled her. She understood now that this had not been a sign of her quality. It had been a sign of the limits of the system she had operated inside. A man arrived from Valtheris with his family, a former palace guard who had heard about the skill ledger and wanted to see if it was what he had been told. He stood at the entrance and waited. Bren walked over to him with the ledger open. He did not ask about rank or house or history. He asked, "What can you do? What do you want to learn?" The man looked at the page for a long moment. He said he could track supply routes and maintain records. He said he had always wanted to learn construction. Bren wrote both things down. Mira watched the name appear in ink, not below another name, not ranked, simply present alongside the others. She had spent years standing next to an Alpha King and trying to make his power kind. She understood now that she had been solving the wrong problem. Power that required her presence to be kind was not stable. It was dependent. It was one replacement away from reverting to what it had been. The thing that lasted was the system that did not need a good person at its center. The thing that lasted was the ledger. When Mira left, they said the Omegas had taken the kingdom's power with her. They were wrong. The Omegas had only taken back the power that had always been theirs.